So one of the strategies to keep in the zone of fabulousness is when we're debriefing to make sure we do that with connection. And so that we're not going to abandon each other. We've made a commitment to each other. I stay with you. I make sure you're connected to your body, your spirituality, community, other people. I may have to offer you choices of what it is you need to do because you'll be overwhelmed. We want to make sure we go with the question, what do you need? Not what happened to you, because we don't want to re-traumatize each other, right? But then we have to have a conversation about what it is we did right. Because all the research for responding to this epidemic is coming from these kind of conversations. And then we have to be generous with each other and ask, what is it that we didn't do right? What's missing here? So that we can find out, the things that we need to do to respond better. So all of those things need to be a piece of us debriefing. And we need to do that with immediacy. We want to be careful that we're not getting to conversations, where we're drinking in a bar together, getting with real negativity, and getting with more and more disconnection. We want to make sure that debrief that we have is one with connection, and that it's about that solidarity that we have that brings us back to the zone of fabulousness.
Some of the things that we learned right away from dealing with overdoses, we were sharing with each other right after having dealt with overdoses. We figured this out. Someone went down in the elevator, and that was a new situation, so we had to how we dealt with being stuck in the elevator, and how we dealt with overdoses that were in really crowded, messy rooms. How we figured out first thing to do is pull the person out of the room into the hallway where we can work on them safely. Like those things that we shared, like from one team to the next shift, about like practical, concrete ways of working where we didn't. There was no formula for it. Well, there was protocols in place, but those protocols were being reevaluated. They were changing all the time. We were learning from each other. When the paramedics came, they'd say, "Oh, we just figured out, from the drugs that showed up last week, that this is what it looks like and this is what's working." And we learned a lot really quickly from doing that, working together with a lot of different people to in ways that had not been done before. And totally different relationship with paramedics now than we had before, because of the way we were passing on information. I don't know if it didn't feel like really debriefing incidents exactly,
No.
And yet it was very spreading out the painful stuff we're going through in ways that were extremely helpful.
Yeah.
For myself, witnessing it and being a part of some of those debriefings, is it changed why we were debriefing and what we were debriefing, and it changed for me that my going away, if we were part of an overdose and we passed it on to the next team, or as someone who's an on-call manager, I would call the other sites and be like, hey, this is what's happening, this is the best way to respond, it was sharing that, and so it felt like a concrete response to it. So the debrief was the information share, but what the next, the ripple effect, or the next effect that came from that was that we were doing something. It wasn't just reliving the situation. You weren't telling me about how you were able to open the person's jaw as a way to relive the trauma or share those details. You were debriefing it in a way that was there was meaning and reason behind it.
Yes.
And so that meant, to me, it felt like again going kind of back to closure. Not that there was ever closure, because the next day was something different, but the sharing of that opened up those lines of communication and conversation, so that debriefing wasn't just about tragedy, and it wasn't just about some horrific thing that had happened. It was debriefing useful responses to things, and that changed for me what debriefing was.
That kind of usefulness helps everybody stay in the work. If there's some idea that that there's a purpose to what you're doing, that it's, you don't need to go into reliving all of the trauma, we don't need to get too close, but if we're staying in the zone, then the fact that we're being useful and constructive and purpose-filled helps us stay in the work longer.
Totally.
The stuff that we're doing matters.
And I think about the generativeness of it, right? So if we just have it from a grief and loss or trauma lens or something like that, then we lose the activism of it, which is the action, which is the call to action, which is a lot of your language, you know. And I was just thinking about MFA where you worked, where you had the first time you had simultaneous overdoses.
Yeah, there's, you know, times it was a building that's 11 stories, and so to use the stairs if the elevators are down, which happens a lot, more than it should, but definitely a lot, is once there was time there was power out, so the elevators weren't working, it was check week, you know, there's like basically all the perfect storm of an overdose that we couldn't get to in time, because we know that there's only a certain amount of time after someone overdoses before brain damage, you know what I mean, so like we know the amount of time that we have to get to somebody. So we just kind of hired some of the folks that live in the building as peers, well not as peers, hired people living in the building, call them peers, to sit in the stairwells with radios. So if there was one, it was a radio, you know what I mean, like we figured out that response. When we figured out that there's numerous overdoses happening with perhaps the same supply, is we had our overdose response. So again, 11 stories, about 250 units. Some of those couples, a whole bunch of guests. That's a lot of people to oversee. So we had our overdose response, which was as soon as we heard more than 2 overdoses in 8 hours, we would have the clipboard of all the people who identified as users who would want to know, or people who knew of the dealers in the building, and then we would go to them and be like, this is what it looks like, this is who's overdosed, to just kind of get the word out amongst everybody, because we're in the middle of responding to overdoses. We also can't, you know, let people know, so just letting the first 10 on the list knew, then they went and let people know, so it was like instantly a building, like within minutes, knew what was happening, so people were able to make an educated response to what they wanted to use or not use alone. And then also knowing that staff were busy responding to numerous overdoses.
Yeah, I think our way of debriefing evolved in the overdose crisis, because I remember before when we would debrief, sometimes we were debriefing our own our own trauma. But I think in this crisis we stopped doing that, and we started passing on like tips, like practical stuff. And I do remember some really cool things that happened where like, I remember one night there was some few overdoses, and I asked the person to track down where those drugs came from, and you know, the individual that brought that you know, provided them, I asked that person in the building to chase that person down, because they were heading to the downtown east side to go to other buildings. So I sent them on a bike to go chase that person down and tell them that the drugs had caused overdoses in our building. And then we knew which building we were going to, so we called that building and described the person and told them, you know, be aware that those drugs caused overdoses in our building. So there was kind of like networks of information going around to try and then out of that eventually we got that, you know, text, bad dope text thing. So these like ways of staying together and passing on information kind of emerged, and people within the building also, like when there was bad drugs in the building, some of the people in the buildings would respond to it in ways like leaving like messages on the doors of the rooms where those came from. I think our ways of debriefing became about practical,
solution-based kind of,
that's the word, thank you.
And what about connection? What about taking care of each other in terms of people not getting lost to disconnection or enmeshment or something, or keeping each other?
I think for us, like in our work, we use the smudge, and you know, when something happens that we're feeling like, you know, we need to take care of ourselves, we would light the smudge, and then everybody loves that, right? People walk in the building and say, oh, you know, thank you, and because it helps not just us but everybody.
I think a lot about the idea that, you know, we're all needed in these movements.
Absolutely.
And that was like a useful frame for all of this, that we can't allow people who have different approaches because they're in different disciplines to be left out, and also it's like also a useful way of bringing people in when they're really struggling too.
Yeah.
And it's like, we want to bring you back into the zone because just like everybody else, you're needed in this
Yeah.
in this fight. If we can help get you to the spot where you can work in a way that's ethical for you.